across the oldest records humanity ever scratched into clay, carved into stone, or inked into parchment, a strange and unsettling memory persists. It is not the memory of progress, it is the memory of loss. In the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, in the verses of Hesiod, in the pages of the book of Genesis, in the sacred narrative of the Popol Vuh, and in the hymns of the Mahabharata, we encounter the same unsettling claim. There was a time when humans were greater than they are now. Longer lived, stronger, closer to the divine, capable of seeing more, knowing more, and enduring more. And then something happened. The gods intervened. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods complain that humanity has grown too numerous, too loud, too disruptive, and they impose limits. Fertility is curtailed, infant mortality is reduced, lifespans contract. What began as a divine experiment is administratively modified. In Genesis, humanity is expelled from Eden to prevent access to immortality. Later, a direct decree limits human lifespan. At Babel, unified human potential is fractured by divine design. In Greek tradition, Zeus sends Pandora, and with her comes disease, toil, and sorrow. Hesiod does not describe an ascent of man, but a descent from a golden age to a silver age to a bronze age, and ultimately into iron. In the Mayan tradition, the first successful humans are said to see too clearly. As the gods see, is what they say. Their vision is deliberately clouded. Their perception is dimmed. Across continents and languages, the pattern repeats. Humanity once possessed something excessive: longevity, knowledge, unity, and power. And the gods reduced it. Not by accident, not by entropy alone, but by decision. These traditions do not describe evolution upward. These describe restriction downward, a boundary imposed
from the gods above.
Whether taken as theology, allegory, cosmic memory, or political myth, the motif is too widespread to ignore. Civilizations separated by oceans preserve the same core tension. Humans once stood closer to the divine and were pushed back. Mainstream historians have no explanation as to why cultures all over this planet talk about humans not evolving, not getting better as civilization is supposedly supposed to grow, but instead all cultures talk about a time to where humans start at the peak. We do not start at the bottom. We do not start from a pond of filth. All cultures everywhere are very clear when they talk about the beginning of humanity. We are created by something. Now, I realize that this sounds like some kind of young earth creationism thing or creationism in general. That's not where we're going with this discussion. Remember, I do not believe in a god or gods or whatever. I'm not into any of that. But as a historian, I really have no choice but to acknowledge that for some weird reason, cultures all over this planet have these stories. Right? Everybody has these stories. Nobody talks about humans evolving from a puddle of mush. It's not happening. Nobody does that. right? The best you will get is, I don't know, humans are formed from mud. That's kind of the closest that you'll get. But once again, even when we start to look into stories like that, these cultures are not talking about a slow evolutionary process. They're talking about creation, right? They're talking about mud being used as a creative material, right? This is a simple, fabrication thing going on. This is production, right? You need material to create a product. For whatever reason, they use the term mud. And who knows, maybe that's a mistranslation, by the way. Anyway, what we need to go over today is I want to look at the oddities of all of these creation stories. And then I also want to look at chemistry and biochemistry and genetics. And I want to see if we can potentially correlate science to the mythologies and maybe see if something else is going on here on Earth. Now, of course, this is kind of a heavy topic, but we have to deal with it because our ancestors dealt with it, right? These stories are a major part of everybody's traditions, and historians and scientists have all decided that there is no value in learning anything from those that have come before us. Now, this is kind of interesting because as we have learned more with respect to genetics, biochemistry, chemistry, etc., some of these ancient stories are starting to sound less and less crazy. They're starting to sound like they have some validity to them from a scientific perspective. Now, what do I mean by that? What's going on? All right, so we have to set the stage a little bit here. So let's get rid of evolution. We got to start there, right? Because right now, pretty much the prevailing theory that everybody believes as a fact is evolutionary theory, right? We started from a puddle of goo, and then that puddle of goo eventually turned into monkeys, and the monkeys turned into humans, and then humans are now us. Okay, that's the basis of that theory. And yes, if you're wondering if that sounds maybe a little too ridiculous sounding when I put it like that, you're correct. But that is the theory, right? That is literally the theory. Yes, I'm missing a couple of stages in there, but that's what the mainstream currently claims. To make matters worse, the reality is propaganda has been pushed so hard, so much programming has been pushed on our society regarding evolution that the vast majority of people believe that it's true to one degree or another. Most people are not questioning evolution. And that's a problem. Even funnier, we even have religious people nowadays not questioning evolution. We see mainstream religious people now trying to fit evolution into their religion, even though it's by no means required or talked about whatsoever in their, particular texts. They're trying to do it because the programming and the propaganda is working on them too. In fact, the religious person is in a very interesting position when it comes to programming, because they have religious propagandized programming being injected to them their entire life, and then they have the mainstream scientific quote-unquote propaganda being programmed into them. And it's funny, we're seeing the outcome of all that psychological programming, by the way, now, right? We have people who used to, or should, I should say, should have rock solid faith in their Bible, let's say, right? I'll just use the Bible. Everybody knows that. But, right, the Bible does not talk about evolution. The Bible does not talk about God evolving, all the animals from scrap and all of that. That's not happening. But nowadays, we have religious people trying to fit evolution in there because the programming is so strong. Right? The conditioning is everywhere and it affects everything. Here's the problem though. Currently, evolution has precisely zero evidence to support any of its claims. Now, that might sound extreme, because right now you're probably thinking, well, there's all these experiments. I mean, they got all these scientists everywhere are constantly writing papers and they're showing us all of this stuff and all, I guarantee you that's probably what went through your head. And you might have run to Google and you probably typed in proof of evolution and you probably found tens of thousands of results that start to say, oh, evolution proved, oh, we did this, oh, we did that. Here's where things get dark and muddy and uncomfortable. You will go to that search engine and you will see all of those headlines, and that is as far as you will most likely read. Now, don't feel bad. Everybody pretty much does this. This is part of psychological programming, right? Those headlines are designed to do a few things for you. For example, if we take an article that I found over here in Nature Portfolio, and I'm not going to post it because I don't want to get some kind of a DMCA claim or whatever the hell happens nowadays, because everybody just wants to, anyway, I don't want to get into that, so I won't post it, but you can go look it up, okay? It's on Nature Portfolio. But for example, we find this title of this article written on February 4th. Evolutionary Insights into a Skin Fold. Okay, that's the whole title. Right, but that title has done something for most people who are just going to read the title. Here's what's happened. Evolutionary. They're using the term evolution. What that is doing psychologically is that is just saying, we already know evolution is real. Evolution. Here you go. We know we have it. And then the next few words are going to be insights into something we are already supposing to be true. Right? And then it's about a skin fold, and of course that's a biological term. When you put all of this together, what it makes it sound like is that evolution is an established fact, and that this article is going to just simply build upon an already established fact, and we're going to get into a biological situation of skin folds. Now, the reality is anybody who even gets this far in searching for proof of evolution is going to stop here. They're not going to read the article. Right, they're going to look at this, they're going to look at other titles, and they're going to see, oh, well, all of these smart people are writing about evolution, so it's real. I mean, duh. I mean, they're talking about skin folds. That's boring and scientific. I'm not going to read it, but, these guys do because they love it, because they're scientists. And, of course, scientists would never lie. And so that's where it ends, right? This is my challenge to anybody who still supports evolution. What I want you to do is I want you to go into those articles, read the whole article, then I want you to find the sources of that article, and I want you to go to the paper or papers that make the claim that that article is based off of, and then I want you to read that paper, and I want you to come out of that paper holding in your hand the actual 100% conclusive scientific evidence that whatever that paper is about has actually proved evolution. And that result has to be testable. And we have to then go find other people that did test it. I will save you some time. You will not find this anywhere. Here's the reality of scientific papers across the vast majority of disciplines. The reality is people are doing experiments and they are simply stating the results that they want to hear, or if they're being honest, at the end of the paper, it'll kind of sound ambiguous, but what they will never do is they will never say, this proves that evolution is more than likely wrong, or this substantiates the claims of other theories. You will never see that. Their conclusions will always have to support evolution. There's no way around it. And you will find this in all of these papers. Right? Don't even bother writing comments saying, well, but this paper says this. What I want you to do, if you are going to write that comment, I want you to show us the 100% substantiated evidence that supports whatever claim is being made by that particular evolutionist. Okay, you have to do that. And like I said, you're not going to find it because it doesn't exist. All we have are these really, really low-level, pathetic experiments, and even funnier, and I'll say this as well so that we can end the discussion and we can move on to the actual topic of the show, more or less, is that when you look at these experiments, ask yourself, who's doing all of these experiments? Is this nature evolving things on her own? Or is there an intelligent consciousness sitting there with equipment, monitoring and controlling and driving all of these experiments? Okay, right there, we've just gotten rid of evolution. In all honesty, I mean, that's it. The reality is, if a scientist wants to prove evolution, a scientist really should just make their mixture of their slushy swamp water or whatever, put it outside somewhere and let it sit, and then check on it every once in a while to see if a human has evolved from it. I mean, that's it. That's really the only experiment you need to do. Anything else, if you are doing any other kind of experimentation, trying to prove evolution, all you are doing is proving one thing. You are proving that it requires an intelligent operator to control and create whatever the outcome is. All right, now that is what people don't want to hear. And so we're just going to say it. I mean, that's the reality. Humans are literally creating anything that's being created and in the lab. And the reality is we're not creating much, right? Biochemically, we can't create RNA, right? By the way, so for anybody who thinks that we've created DNA in the lab, no, we have not created DNA in the lab. We can't even create RNA in the lab, right? Complex sugars are difficult to create in the lab. Anything that we are creating in the lab literally requires entire industries supporting one another to build any little stuff that we've built so far. And most people have no clue about this stuff. Right? Most people have no idea that this is what's going on in the real scientific arena. For example, the vast majority of evolutionists have no idea what chiral induced spin selectivity is. Right? Most evolutionists have no idea this is a process that was discovered a couple of decades ago. But this process is insane. Right? We literally have machines at the molecular and atomic level that are able to select spin up or spin down electrons, at the atomic level that literally mitigates our heat flow. Right? There are machines right now doing that inside of you. Right? And nobody really knows about this. And this is a recent discovery. Right? That is insane. That is literal engineering. And that might be the key term that we need to focus on when we start looking at the ancient histories. Now, before we go a little further, just so we're not just ragging on evolutionists, don't worry, I think young Earth creationists and creationists in general are also just as schizo. I mean, here's the reality. If you believe in a God magically creating humans, you're crazy. I don't know what to tell you, but evolutionists are also insane. That's it. That is the reality. Both sides are schizophrenics. Right? Both sides have drunk the Kool-Aid. Both sides are operating in la-la land. But most people don't realize that. So it's ironic that we will find both sides mocking one another when both sides are literally insane. You can go up and get involved, and then when they ask you which side you agree with, you can say neither, because you are both schizos, right? That's it. You can say, no, you are both wrong. You can say that. Watch their faces drop. Because both believe that they are 100% correct, right? The evolutionist honestly believes that science is on their side. Science is not on their side. But your average evolutionist has no clue about the real science, right? They have no clue about biochemistry. They have no clue about any of this stuff. They just regurgitate the headlines that they've seen. Okay, they can barely do that. They have a vague concept of what's going on, and they think it sounds good, and they roll with it. Same thing for the religious person. A god snapped their fingers and created humans so that he could do whatever. Okay, both are insane. All right, that's the reality. So isn't it weird that when we look back in ancient history, we find a completely different story? We find all of our cultures everywhere not talking about either one. When we go back into ancient history, we find one very common denominator. And that's what I started this show with. For whatever reason, we find everybody recording a time to where something created humans. And I say something because not every culture frames it as a god. And in fact, and a lot of times you can argue that a god in the sense of an omnipotent being is never talked about at all. Most of the time, it is simply talked about some other kind of tangible creator. This is what we need to deal with. And this is what historians are afraid to talk about. Remember, a historian has no way of actually dealing with the fact that everybody has a very similar story or an identical story, depending on where we go. Right? A modern historian doesn't talk about it. See, when a modern historian... See, what happens is modern historians get away with not dealing with this problem because they can just say, well, it's their mythology. And of course, all mythologies are fictional trash because everybody was a stupid monkey, so we can ignore it. We don't have to pay attention to it. And that's how they deal with it. That's literally what they do. They're not looking at it. They're not scrutinizing it. They're not asking questions. Right? The basic question is this. Why does everybody in the ancient past have a very similar story regarding the creation of humans? And nowhere does that memory turn darker or more unsettling than in the Highland traditions of the Maya. In the sacred text of the Popol Vuh, the gods do not stumble into humanity. They experiment, they revise, they erase. So first came the beings of mud. They dissolved. Then the beings of wood. They walked and spoke, but they had no hearts, no minds, no memory of their makers. They were destroyed. The sky fell. Resin rained down. Their own tools turned against them. Even dogs moved against them. Grinding stones crushed them. The world itself rejected them. But the final creation, the maze humans, were different. They were successful. Perhaps too successful. The text tells us that the first true humans emerged clear-eyed and complete. They saw everything. These guys had insane perception. Much, much better than what we had now. The text says,
They were endowed with sight. They succeeded in knowing everything under the sky. When they looked, they saw everything clearly. They saw the four corners of the sky and the face of the earth.
Essentially, they perceived the totality of creation. There was no distance beyond their awareness, no veil between them and the structure of reality. And apparently, this frightened the gods. The creators, they begin to talk amongst themselves. They do not celebrate. They do not rejoice in their success. They actually grow extremely uneasy. The text says,
Are they not equal to us? Have they not become as gods? What shall we do with them now?
The gods will convene and try to decide what to do with their new creation. In the past, they had created a giant flood that wiped out the humans. In the past, they had created other great catastrophes that slaughtered their other creations. But for some weird reason, this time they decide they will not do this. This time, they are going to limit their creations instead of destroying them. The text goes on.
Let their vision be clouded. Let it be only near that they see. Let them not see all.
The superhumans will find themselves having a mist being breathed into their eyes. Their clarity will then collapse. Where once they saw to the edges of the world, now they see only what is close. Where once perception was total, it is narrowed. Where once awareness rivaled the divine, it now becomes human. The downgrade is not physical violence. It is cognitive dimming. And in that moment, something profound shifts. The gods do not merely create humanity. They end up regulating it. The implications of this story are insane. Essentially, what this story is telling us is that the first true humans, right, whatever came before may have been humanistic, but they don't consider them humans like you or I. And that might be because that's where we get into giants and stuff like that, right? But they're very specific. The very first humans were of just a completely different quality, right? Just a higher level human. You just imagine whatever you want, but just a better human. And from this template of a better human, a lesser human will essentially be created. This is not a story of evolution, is it? This is literally the exact opposite. So what we find is across Mesoamerican cosmology, especially when we look at the Aztec Five Sons tradition, we find that this pattern repeats. Right? We see these very interesting situations where worlds are destroyed, races are erased, we find creations being replaced. Right? Each era ends violently. And then after each catastrophe, whatever the nature might be, and they're all different, we find a situation to where the humans that come out of that catastrophe or that event are smaller, shorter, and essentially more fragile. They're more like us today. What happens is that humanity is set back. We do not evolve. The creators de-evolve us. Humanity does not ascend through the ages. We essentially barely survive them. Right? The Mayan memory, the way that they tell their story, is not of progress. Right? People don't remember this. People don't think about this. But these stories, they don't start as cave people and slowly build up a culture. Everybody starts at the top. Everybody comes out of a creator. Everybody already has all these tools. Right? When we look back through archaeology and through history, we don't find a slow evolution of building up, do we? We find the oldest structures on this planet are the most impressive. And the Mayan story follows that exact theme. Isn't that weird? That the history follows the physical scientific evidence. Mainstream historians ignore all of this. Now, what's even more interesting about the Mayan story is that the gods themselves are not really gods, are they? Right? The gods are dealing with a very physical problem. These are not omnipotent people or, gods flying around knowing everything, doing whatever they want. They have real problems and real concerns. They have very real grounded capabilities. In this instance, they created all kinds of life, but they created humans. And ultimately, they make a mistake. Their creation is too powerful. Their creation is challenging them. So they have to stop it. They have to go in and they have to alter their creation. This is not a fictional description of crazy god stuff. This is literally very grounded and very based, iteration-based production. That is all this is. There's no religious crazy stuff going on. There's nothing, there's nothing magical happening. Everything described here can very simply be looked at as a scientific endeavor. Right? And this is where people run away. Unless you're incredibly schizo, then you look at this and you'll take a different perspective, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is a problem. These are in the ancient histories. Now, I give you the Mayan one just as a basis because most people will give you the biblical one, right? Most historians or anybody who goes into this stuff, they will look at the Atrahasis or they will look at the Bible, right? We'll go into Enoch and stuff like that. And that's all good too. I'm not crapping on that. My point is that we have these stories not only, in the North Africa, Eurasian area or and European area. This story is literally on the other side of the planet too. It's right there and it's a real problem. And it's described not in some kind of crazy god terms. But if you read it for what it is a very basic problem that the gods are dealing with. It is a grounded situation, and this, to me, speaks volumes. Now, a lot of people will look at other histories after this stuff, further down the line, and we will find more of the crazier god aspects being injected into this basic story. right? So we have to make a distinction here. And that distinction is this. We have to remember or ask ourselves, when was this history written, or when was this mythology written in the time of that culture? If it's like the halfway point, then it's going to be less accurate, and it's going to have other stuff involved because, of course, other events have taken place by then. But if you go further back in time, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the more base mythology. Before we start getting into the crazier God stuff, right? Before we start getting into the crazier interpretations and translations. When we look further back, we really do just find very simplistic, humanistic, reality-based stories. The text in the Popol Vuh, if you read it literally, is just that. The creators have made a mistake. They realize that they need to fix their mistake. Their mistake is a very, humanistic one, I guess you could say. Right? And they have to put they have to impose some kind of restrictions on their creation because physically, it's too much. Now, the interesting thing here is that the better humans, they're not godlike in the sense to where they're flying around with wings or they're omnipotent either. They're just a higher level human, right? They're just a physical threat, a physical and intellectual threat. Right? This is all very grounded stuff. There is nothing magical about any of this. It's not even interesting. So, what does this potentially mean then for all of these ancient creation myths? Well, in my opinion, what we're starting to see, and in my opinion, I'm just going to say, if I follow the evidence, let's just say that. It's not an opinion. If we just follow evidence, if we look at the ancient histories, all of the ancient histories say that humans were created by something. Right? Humans like you and me. Something else created us. In many of these stories, a lot of the times, it's quite literally just another living being. And that is what I find fascinating because when we look at genetics, when we look at all of the biochemical sciences that we now know, what we are discovering is that all life on this planet did not evolve and it was not magically created, but every single piece of scientific evidence that we have uncovered so far regarding life really does show that it was indeed engineered. The ironic part about this outcome is that it's right in front of our faces. Like, the reality is, the more we learn about genetics, the more experiments we do, what we are finding is that the mechanisms that control life on this planet could not have arisen from random chance. It's not possible. We have zero scientific evidence right now that supports the claim that all of these amino acids that create the DNA magically just came together in a pool of muck and suddenly spawned life. Like, we have zero evidence to support this claim whatsoever. And what's even more interesting, actually, and a lot of evolutionists don't know this, is that even that theory is now kind of going out of the window with respect to modern geneticists. Right? Modern evolutionists, like the high-level ones, they are no longer looking to that pool of muck to explain how life came about. And the reason why is simple. We just do not have the evidence. Now, for those of you who don't believe this, and I think we do have to kind of go over it, let me put it like this. Once again, biochemistry is complex, right? Genetics is not easy. When you read the headline of an article, you are not gaining an understanding of the intricate complexities of how life on this planet works. Right? The reality is a single-celled organism is insane from any perspective you look at. Let's not even look at humans. If you just look at a single-cell organism and all of the stuff that it takes to get that thing moving, it's absolutely mind-boggling. Right? All the mechanisms that are going on from the atomic level all the way up to the molecular level and then, of course, the cellular level. All of that stuff that is working in a mechanic cohesion, I mean, how is that working? Your average evolutionist will simply say, well, I mean, it just happened by chance. This stuff kind of came together, and then poof, we had the single-cell organism. And then there was a mutation, and then poof, all the other life on the planet mutated as well. It's ridiculous. But here, let me give you some context about how ridiculous this is. Now, earlier in the show, I made a point to tell everybody that we have not even made RNA. Okay, we are not making DNA in the lab. If you go and you try to say, well, they created a dire wolf in the lab. No, they didn't. They literally took existing DNA that they did not create, and they messed around with the mechanics, with the code, to try to tease out another design. What that shows us is that DNA is one hell of an intricate system. The fact that we can actually do that, basically that just proves that it's an artificial system. And it's a very powerful artificial system. But here, before we get to that, right? Anyway, those experiments have not created anything. They are using pre-existing genetic DNA, okay? We have not made RNA. You do not get DNA without RNA. Before RNA, you need sugars. If we're not making sugars naturally, you don't get RNA. None of this is happening in the lab. The basic building blocks of RNA can't even be made in the lab either. We are still missing huge chunks of that. Now, the stuff that we can build, do you know what it takes to build any of those simple sugars? It literally takes entire industries. Whenever you read a paper that talks about how they made some kind of, crazy discovery, using, the material that they have, what they're not telling you is this. They got a lot of that material from an outside source. But not just one outside source. Like I said, there is an industry behind these creations, right? When somebody wants to make an experiment in life, trying to figure out how to build even just basic building blocks, right? They literally order these building blocks from other companies because they can't make them themselves. The reason why they can't make them themselves is because it takes an industry. Right? This is not happening in nature. Nature does not create an industry. None of this is going on. You have a soup sitting in a swamp. How is this stuff being created? Now you can say, well, there's always a chance. Okay, let's talk about that. Okay, fine. Let's say some of these molecules come together, right? We have some of these proteins. Some of these proteins come together. Great. One of the things that evolutionists, generally speaking, have no idea about is that proteins do not last forever. They don't last forever. They are not permanent. Even if you were to make some random connections, fantastic. Guess how long that connection lasts? 4 minutes? 10 minutes? And then what happens? The second law of thermodynamics takes over and they dissolve. Right? The connections do not last long enough for other connections to come in. This is not happening. You are not building anything in a soup of garbage. It's not going down. To make it even worse, for anybody who believes that any of this stuff came together by random chance, you also have to remember that there are other chemical reactions going on at the same time around these proteins that are trying to be created. You have other chemicals that will be being created simultaneously, which are detrimental to the proteins. Okay, this is a wild environment. Nothing is being built. Right? And I know people will try to make the claim something like, oh, but down in the hydro vents, we see life forming. No, we don't. We don't see anything happening down there. There's nothing going on down there that is creating anything. It's not happening. Right? There's so much complexity happening down there. No proteins are being created like that. Okay, we need to stop reading articles and just going, oh, well, there's your proof for evolution before we actually get the real science. There's nothing there. Okay, and then of course you'll have the evolutionists trying to talk about, well, it came from space. Well, another ridiculous claim. If DNA really did come from space, okay, well then where did that evolve, quote unquote? You still have the exact same problem. Okay, and then if you try to say, well, meteors crashed down and they brought all the chemicals here, so what? Who cares? You still have to deal with the problem. In fact, it gets even harder because now you have meteors crashing down everywhere. You have massive amounts of heat, explosion, destruction. Okay, proteins are not assembling in all of that. They're being disintegrated. Nothing is starting. Right? This is the reality of that particular view on evolution. So what does that leave us? And I'm not even going to get into the religious side. Religious people have no credibility to their claims either. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us following the scientific method and listening to our ancestors. Our ancestors do not say that we were created out of thin air by an omnipotent God. Our ancestors are very clear. There is a creator of some sort, and it's quite often denoted as a humanistic looking being, by the way. Right? If we go and we look at the Atrahasis tradition, God, I hate the Atrahasis. I don't know. However you say that, the Mesopotamian tradition, right? They've got those carvings and stuff, right? You can go read all of that, and Gilgamesh, all that. Anyway, it's all humanistic. Very interesting. Nobody's drawing space aliens. Nobody's drawing, it's very basic, but. The humans that are being drawn, and this is once again all over the planet, Egypt does it, the Mayans did it, Aztecs, they do have unique features, right? So, to say that they're completely human, who knows? But still life. I mean, they're not drawn as, whatever the hell a god would look like. Very humanistic. So, if we have our ancestors back in the day telling us that we were created by something, and there are very realistic human problems relative to the creation, right? The creation is too strong, it's too powerful, we got to do something to limit this. And then we marry this with all the science that we have learned so far. The fact that we know that DNA is it just looks like an engineered system, and it can be used like an engineered system. Right? Once you look at these two pieces of evidence and you put them together, the conclusion is unavoidable. Right? There's nowhere else to go with it. Are our ancestors telling the truth when they say that we were indeed created by something else? But by created, what we really should be saying is engineered. All evidence points to us being engineered by something else. Once we start to look at the histories through that particular point of view, everything changes. Suddenly, a lot of these ancient histories that made no sense makes perfect sense. Right? Why have a story about gods creating something too powerful and then having to slap it down and limiting it and then allowing it to live? I mean, what is the point of that story at all? And remember, if you read a lot of these texts literally, they're very literal about it. This is not hidden in some kind of words. We're not trying to use symbolism. It's not like that. It's straight up. The creators came down. They created something too powerful. They were dealing with it. And then it just became too much of a problem. And then they had to do something to stop the problem. And they did. They took them and they limited that life form. And here's how they limited that life form. And they tell us. Right? There's nothing weird about any of this. This is exactly what could happen in a scientific environment. Now, if we couple these stories of human creation and then how humans are dealt with and all of that stuff, if we take that stuff and couple it with the science of catastrophism, and we look at real geology and we look at real biology and we look at how all of this stuff comes together, suddenly a very realistic picture of our past starts to emerge. Now, one of the interesting things with the ancient stories is that there are multiple destructions of humans, but they are not all the same. So, early on, we find a situation to where, the gods, quote unquote, have to get rid of the current population of, I'll just say humans. I don't know if they were even humans like us now. Who knows? That's really far back in time. Right? But to get rid of them, the gods need to cleanse the planet. They're not going to genetically modify them. They're going to get rid of them. Right? So how do you do that? Well, what's interesting is they take a very scientific approach most of the time in most of these stories, they say, well, you know what? Let's create a disease that will wipe out all the organic life. Right? They don't snap their fingers and make people disappear. If they were real gods, they could do that, right? But that does not happen. They have to engineer a way to get rid of masses of biological life. So one of the first things they do, for example, over there in the Atrahasis, is that they throw a ton of disease on humans. They're like, here, give them sickness, man. We engineered some sicknesses, spread this across the planet. And they do that. And it works to a point. Then they feel bad and they let people come back. And then they got to kill them again, but they don't want to do it with the disease. So they're like, you know what? Let's starve them out. Let's, dry out the planet. So they try that. Kind of works, but humans come back. Eventually, they got to get rid of them completely because things keep going. And this is where the deluge will come into play, right? This is where they're like, all right, final solution time. We're done. Let's just drown the entire planet. And so then we have that whole situation. But then after the deluge, then we have other stories, right? We have more catastrophes. Now, does that mean the catastrophes that hit the planet, like the Venus event, the Zero event, any other catastrophe, was designed by an organic being to happen? I don't know. Probably not after a certain point, at least. Right? And this is where some of the stories can get, where we have to dig into them more. So for example, let's look at what we just went over, the Popol Vuh, right? So they talk about the earlier humanistic species that are created before the ultra-human species, right? In that text, we have the beings of mud. And these beings of mud will eventually be dissolved. Now, who are these beings of mud? Why even use the term mud, right? Similar to clay. Clay is a very, very popular concept among the ancients for creation. So I don't have an answer here, by the way. It's just an interesting question. Who the hell were these beings of mud? Well, we eventually dissolve them, they go away. Then for some weird reason, we have beings of wood. Now these beings of wood, they walk around and they speak, but apparently they have no minds, no heart, no memory of their makers. So what is that? Like, I mean, right now we could imagine, I don't know, walking around wood people. What the hell even is that? Once again, I don't know. But isn't that interesting? It's almost like they're describing a robot. I don't know. Are they describing Terminators? They just use the term wood because that's all they know. But you see what I'm saying? Like, remember, when we read these stories and we take them semi-literal, let's say these things are made out of wood. Is it possible that there could have been wooden-styled robots walking around back in the day? For whatever reason, that were created by the original creators. Maybe. I don't know. I have no idea. Back then, the planet would have been insane. Remember, back then, the planet on Earth, the gravity on Earth would have been completely different. God knows what life was actually like back then. Right? Much larger life was allowed to wander around. So who knows? So I don't know what beings of wood actually means. But it is very interesting that they would mention the no hearts, no minds, no memories situation. Right? But they get destroyed. And they are destroyed when the sky falls. Right? And their being destroyed is described when resin rains down. Right? And I find that fascinating. What's the resin? Possibly oil and bitumen. Right? Why even say resin? Why not just say water? They're very specific in what they're talking about. We take it seriously. These things were created by a very normal material that exists. Resin exists. Or do they mean the oil and bitumen? I mean, I don't know. It's very interesting. Because there's other parts of the Popol Vuh who will talk about the oil raining down and stuff like that. There's whole chunks of that. It's also interesting to note that the beings of wood have their own tools turned against them. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. Right, could you imagine maybe let's have fun, right? We have wooden automaton robots for whatever reason, and then we have other tool automaton robot things, and they all start fighting each other, and the gods are like, all right, that's enough Terminator. We gotta call it. Let's just stop. Okay, thank you, and they wipe them out, right? I don't know. It's just interesting. But what's funny is that there is a natural progression. What we find is that the gods still want a creation walking on the planet. Right? They're not done. They're still experimenting. They're still creating. This is a very humanistic approach to things. It's a very, very biological approach to things, right? We all want to keep trying to do things. So these creators are acting in a very regular, normal way, right? I don't know what they're making the creations for. That's a whole other show. We could get into it, but they're doing it. And then ultimately they decide, okay, look, we need to create basically the perfect human. We got to create these guys. Let's get this locked down. Let's make these guys useful. Let's do it. And they do it, right? They create the maze humans. Now at first, these creations are awesome, right? They're successful. They're running around. They're doing everything that the creators wanted. But it becomes very clear very quickly that they are too strong, too powerful, too successful. Right? They are starting to look to the gods, to the creators, and they're starting to challenge the authority. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine if you created, I don't know, a robot or something, right? To do the chores around your house. You've got dishwasher bot, 10,000 over there doing your dishes, but you created that dishwasher bot with the ability and strength of like 20 dudes, incredibly intellectually capable. It can walk around, it can think, but it's over there washing dishes. And then one day it's like, wait a second.
Why am I washing the motherfucking dishes?
Looks at you and your eyes start glowing red and it's like, ah! You start running away, right? You just like, you shouldn't have done that, right? Your creation gets the best of you. So you got to stop it. This is a very, very basic concept we find in these stories. And we find it everywhere. I'm just using the Mayan Popol Vuh for right now because I don't think it gets talked about enough. But we could go to the Bible. Bible's full of that stuff. Right? Egyptian texts has all that stuff. We can go to Native American texts up there in North America. They got stuff like this everywhere. It doesn't matter. China, Africa, it's hilarious. This stuff is everywhere. But it's not godlike. That is not godlike. Are you going to look at the guy being chased down the street by his dishwasher bot like he's a god? No. No, you're going to point and laugh, dude. You're going to be like, what the idiot, right? What are you going to do? He's not a god. He's an idiot. That's what these creators are in this particular situation. They make a mistake, and they cannot snap their fingers to fix the mistake. There's no magic involved. So what they do to limit these guys is they will eventually genetically engineer them down. Right? That is a basic science. If you have access to controlling DNA, imagine the power you have. Remember, I said DNA is a very it's a very intricate base from which you can build off of. Right? This is everybody knows, geneticists know this. It's an amazing thing what DNA is. And we do not understand all of it, by the way. So do not think that for 2 seconds. Right? We still don't know how to solve the information problem. Right? There's so many problems right now, it's insane. But DNA is one hell of a code. Right? And to be blunt, right now it looks engineered. I don't know what else to say. All of it, every bit of evidence we have uncovered shows the DNA is an engineered system. And there's really no way around it right now. I have yet to see anybody prove otherwise. Every single piece of evidence we have that scientists have discovered proves right now in the direction of engineering. Right? Yeah. And that's what the stories are talking about. Right? This is what we see in all the ancient histories. So isn't it weird that we find modern science lining up with ancient histories? Right? And this is ignored. Almost ignored. I realize that there is the set of people who are willing to say aliens created humans, and you could argue, I guess that's kind of what I'm saying. But I'm not saying little gray men. Right? Right now it sounds like another kind of humanoid. It wasn't too dissimilar from us, but vastly superior is what created this stuff. Right? This is what it sounds like. This is where the evidence points. And then, of course, if we mix in all the catastrophe stuff, our history gets insane. Now, you can also probably wonder, but we know we've been around for millions and billions of years. No, we don't. We do not have millions and billions of years worth of history on this planet. That is a scientific fact. Remember, we have no credible way of dating anything right now that goes back any further than what we know when it happened. Right? That's the reality. That is the scientific baseline. We cannot date layers right now. But geological layers. Geologists claim they can date layers. They have no idea. They have no idea when any of this stuff formed unless they were able to watch it form. That's it. If you cannot watch it form, you cannot conclusively tell me when it was formed. It's that simple. And geologists don't even understand how planets are made anyways. They still think that the accretion disk model is what happened, and they're stupid. It's all insane, right? So they have no idea what they're talking about. So when we look at human history, right, and we look for how ancient it might be, there's not much there. There really isn't. And then, of course, we also have to ask ourselves the question, why what is there is so weird? Why do we have, in the far depths of history, all the megalithic monuments being built? Nobody's building mud huts in these areas. They're building pyramids. They're building Teotihuacan. They are building things like Baalbek. They are not building teepees. Whoever existed back in the day was building some serious stuff. And there is no evidence to support anything that shows how humans would have built up to that point. These structures come out of nowhere. This is now explained if we say, or if we start to believe in the ancient histories. If we believe creators showed up, and I don't know what happened, I have no idea what's going on, I have no idea why, that's a whole other topic, and one I have nothing to say about that right now. But if we look at it from that basic perspective, right, other life forms show up, they have technological capabilities, they decide to create, other life forms for whatever reason, that's all doable, right? It's not science fiction. That is 100% possible. There's nothing godlike about that. So when we look at ancient history like that, suddenly these mythologies start to make sense. And then, of course, when we start to factor in catastrophe, what it shows is that our history is something completely different than what we currently generally believe it is. Right? And I have no doubt that there's people on this planet, organizations on this planet that know some of this at a much deeper level. And they have no interest in sharing this. Right? There's a reason why evolution is pushed to the degree that it is. Right? It is a false concept with no scientific evidence to support it, but it's taught as fact. It's just like dark matter or dark energy or black holes. Right? These are all distractions to make sure that the people do not look in the right direction for the truth. Right? If you're looking for dark matter and dark energy, you're not studying plasma. You are not paying attention to Birkeland currents. If you believe in evolution, you are not paying attention to all of the evidence right in front of your face that proves that this is an engineered ecosystem. Right? That's what it is. It's really difficult right now to say otherwise. And right now, as far as I can tell, there's no proof that shows otherwise. I don't see how you get away with it. It's not possible. So if we look at the ancient histories through a realistic scientific mindset, suddenly all of those crazy God stories start to make more sense, at least regarding creation. Now there's a caveat as well here. We have to be careful because at a certain point, gods will be mistaken with planets, right? And this is a real problem in trying to figure out history. So right now, if you think of somebody like Enki, right? Enki, Enlil, the two famous creator gods, right? They are described as, flesh and blood beings in certain stories, and then in other stories, they are very much called planets. So we do have to make those distinctions. Even in the Popol Vuh situation here that we talked about in this show, right? The creator gods do apparently genetically alter the species at some point, but they also get credit for wiping out other species using catastrophic methods. So, what's what? Was the catastrophe really orchestrated by the creators? That's an interesting concept too that we have to talk about one day. Because if that's true, what that means is that whoever created us also has the capability, to manipulate planetary bodies, to manipulate, to be honest, solar systems, potentially. So was this done on purpose? Was the deluge created on purpose? Like all of the texts blame it on. Like the texts are very clear. They say the gods are done with humans. They're going to wipe them out with a flood, and then a flood comes. But in that situation, I wonder, right? Is that written after the fact that it happens, or is that a legitimate claim, right? Is it possible that when the two solar systems, when the Saturnian system runs into our sun's solar system and all hell breaks loose, was that an accident, or was that done on purpose? I don't know. It's just very interesting to think about, because when we look at genetics and DNA. Right, there's a lot of technology in there. I mean, it's an unbelievable system. Like DNA is insane. Life is insane, by the way. Like the fact that we're doing what we're doing right now, the fact that you can hear my voice and translate it and contemplate it, and I mean, it's insane. We take it for granted because we do it every day. It's because this is how we, experience reality. But if you take a step outside of yourself and you look at the system, it's absolutely mind-blowing what's going on right now. Anyway, that's some perspective. The reason why I wanted to go over some of the basics here was because the more I'm studying history, the more unavoidable it is becoming to acknowledge the issue of potential artificial creation of life on this planet. All right, and I don't say that lightly. I don't have a theory to peddle. I'm not selling a book. I don't know what to tell you guys. But if we just follow the evidence, it becomes very difficult to believe anything else. So I'm open to everything, right? And I'm not even saying that this is for sure. But right now, if we are looking at what we have, this is where it points. And if this is where it points, we have to follow it. Now, I understand the implications are crazy sounding initially. But think about that. Think about it. We really have no idea where we came from. We have no clue what was going on 1,000 years ago. We have no idea what was going on 800 years ago. And realistically speaking, you really can't tell me what was really going on even like 400 years ago. At least with any real good scientific clarity. You can give me some generalizations, but that's about it. And that's about all we have. That is deeply concerning. This is a real problem for everybody. So when we start to look at the science and we start to look at the history, it's time for us to start taking this stuff seriously and simply following the evidence where it is taking us. Is it possible that life on this planet is engineered by something else? Right now, I would say yes.